All right, hi everyone. We are talking about hierarchical entities. I've forgotten if we live streamed the previous iteration of this, um, but if we didn't, um, well, let's see. This is about what are these creatures? Wait a minute. An entity, okay, has a subtype that is a species, subtype that is a bird. I see. Winged entity. All right. So we have some kind of partial ordering here, we think. Is it a partial ordering or is it something more complicated?
Yes, a partial order or a lattice.
Okay. Okay. You know, one day we should have some functions that are specifically about partial orders and posets and so on, because they just seem to come up all over the place.
Maybe in the quantum logic package.
Oh gosh, is that? I don't even know the. I guess that's another place they show up. Okay, all right. So now, what guide me through what we're talking about here?
Yes. So the first diagram above is just to illustrate the idea of a concrete type and then specializations thereof, and going up more abstract types. Yeah. And below we see a prototype of our built-in entities with the example of species. Yeah.
This is how the next species really will be built on. So that's not theoretical, that's practical.
For instance, animals have a body temperature, but other species don't.
Right. Okay. So this is a notion of progressive specialization. And this is our kind of model of the world, that things have there's sub-specialization. And that's probably a reasonable model. I mean, at this level, that's probably the next step up from the notion of entities that we have right now, entities with individual types. This is the subtype type thing. Okay. Okay, so what do we have to figure out here? Oops.
So we can see if we focus on a particular animal, then only part of that hierarchy applies. Yeah, in this case, a human, and humans have a body temperature. Yeah? And the new thing is that now you're mixing types that appear in the entity first argument and in the entity property first argument. Yeah, that is a new proposed feature.
Right. That if it's a sub-entity, a subtype, then it can appear in that way. Yes. Clearly, if I have an entity, well, it could be the case that if I have an entity, an animal entity here, now if I say in this, if I say entity, animal, Homo sapiens, will that still work?
Currently not. And
that's not a good thing.
The idea is that we should have a unique identifier if we refer to the same thing.
No, that's not going to work. I mean, I don't understand that. Why wouldn't you be able to use a subtype if this thing, because we know this thing is a member of that subtype down here, right?
Yes. So we could, but what would we gain by doing that?
Well, that you don't have to remember how to get up to the supertype, because what level of supertype do you go to? I mean, we could go to the supertype of just thing. How do we know we're not doing that? And remember, we've agreed that the naming here does not have to be unique across beyond our current level of types. That is, there's nothing that says that gold as a color and gold as an element have to have distinct string names. They're distinguished by the fact that they're in different levels of entity. Do you get what I'm saying?
Not different level, different branches.
Different branches, yes. They're different branches. And at what level in that tree are things disambiguated? Right? There's a different level of types that define a scoping of names than down at the level of animals and so on. In other words, if you have an animal and a fungus, can they have the same string name? Yes or no?
I would say
Yes.
no.
I would also say no, because
Okay,
they are
so
both
tell me at what
species.
level. Tell me at what level you have the name disambiguation. Right, you're going to have a level which is basically our current types,
Yep.
at which there is name disambiguation, and at the lower levels, well, by implication, there's also name disambiguation, but at higher levels, there isn't name disambiguation.
So looking at Tony's top chart, one candidate would be the most abstract concrete type, so that the name would live on, say,
yeah,
species.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
So this is that's right. But those are the things that we have currently given type names to. So we're tagging types of types, so to speak. And that is a scoping type, so to speak. We can call it, something like a scoping type.
Mhm.
But then I really think it should be the case. I mean, the canonical form of entity animal, Homo sapiens could be the scoping type. Do you see what I'm saying?
But this is, I
Yeah.
think, what Tony was advertising already last time, that this would be the canonical version. The question where we last time ended was, are there non-canonical versions?
Okay, so the question is, if you say entity animal Homo sapiens, does it stay like that or does it evaluate to taxonomic species? Is that correct? That's the question.
That's the
That's
question.
a version of it, yeah.
Well, actually, we should distinguish. Entities, by representing things, should never evaluate, but we could have a canonicalization
Yeah.
procedure.
Well, okay, whatever. I'm not so sure about that,
Yeah.
but let's assume. Okay, so then you can say entity animal Homo sapiens, and the system has got to know that you go to the supertype. If you want to disambiguate that, you have to go to the supertype. Now, if I say entity property, if I say entity animal ragweed, which is a plant, that will somehow fail. Is that correct? Or what
Yeah,
should that do?
Some unknown entity. Yeah.
Okay, but that would say unknown entity as a plant, as an animal, so to speak, even though it's not unknown as a taxonomic species. So even though it's scoping type, even though it has a correct enclosing scoping type, it does not have a correct proximal type, so to speak. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so here, then, we can say, I see. So we're looking at entity classes, and we're saying that I'm confused by this. Normally, entity class, when I say entity class, members of the United Nations or something, how do I write that?
Control equal.
Okay, okay, I can just do that.
I think that's the difference between the named entity classes and the implicit entity classes.
Okay. Is that an end? Oh, for God's frigging sake. Is this still broken? Can somebody please report that again? Is anybody here who can do that? Or am I doing that myself? Thank you. And you can note this as well, because that's just wrong. Okay, so there. Wait a minute. How do I get this thing?
Entity list.
No, I don't want entity list.
So,
I want to see what this is.
Also, Control Shift I.
Input form. Yeah.
Okay, so that's an entity class. Oh, I see. That's an implicit entity class.
No, that's an explicit one.
No, that I know, but I'm looking down here. These are implicit entity classes.
Right.
Entity classes within that type. Okay.
I mean, the second one of the classes example is something you should look carefully that you understand what it is. So you
This here.
ask, yeah, like make / input form on the result that you are clear what happened here.
Why is that taking forever?
So that is not deployed yet. So
Yeah,
that
this
is
was
our
yeah.
internal.
Okay, well, why don't you tell me what the result then was?
Make Control C to go back. And then now type in / input form. Yeah. So we did this canonicalization in this step.
Yeah.
Which I feel has pros and cons.
Okay, but I mean, you could go both ways here.
Yeah.
Because you could also say, let's shrink wrap this down to the smallest entity type that applies.
No, I feel like the only natural one, they shrink wrap to the one you ask about.
Well, that's fine, but I'm saying that another function could shrink wrap you down in the partial ordering to the thing that is
Smallest.
most proximate to the elephant.
Yes.
In other words, you could go both ways in this hierarchy. You could say, I mean, what you should be able to do is to generate the full hierarchy up to the scoping type, even beyond the scoping type. In other words, just like you can say of an elephant, it is in a certain family, phylum, class, whatever, kingdom, right? You should be able to do that with respect to the types here. And one could even imagine naming, just like one does in the taxonomic hierarchy, naming those levels in certain cases.
We could just have a new string sub-value, something like type hierarchy.
Yeah, that's fine.
And it could go upwards and downwards. Of course, then we need a little bit of non-trivial return type, a graph or something like this.
Well, I think that there's what's above you is always just a sequence. What's below you, I mean, you can have the sidebars.
Yes.
You can have the sidebars, but there is always a way up to the scoping type is always a linear sequence.
Yes, you're right.
And there's your siblings, which might make more of a graph.
Yeah.
Which might be also worth having. I mean, in general, it's some kind of directed, well, it's a poset, but it's also a directed graph of some kind. Let's see. So, okay, let's keep going here just to understand this. So I'm not committing to whether I think it's right to return the scoping type or to return the proximal type, okay, or to return the input type. I mean, in other words, clearly there's going to be, I think there might be an argument for returning the scoping type, because the scoping type always can do purely syntactic equality comparisons, right? It's canonical. The scoping type for an entity is a canonical representation of the entity.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Right. But the proximal type, well, I mean, when we say, I'm going to define terms here, because I mean, when we say the proximal type would be the smallest shrink wrap type around the entity, right? So in the hierarchy, it is the last thing on that sequence. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying? Yes?
No, I did not understand.
Okay, so look, you've got a hierarchy of types. There are types below animal.
Yeah.
Right, and above elephant.
Yeah.
Right, so imagine the sequence that ends in elephant.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm saying is the proximal type is the one immediately above elephant. I mean, elephant isn't a type. Elephant is just an entity. It is the thing. If you look at the type hierarchy,
I see
it is the last element of the type hierarchy. Okay, now if you go below that in the type hierarchy. So let's say you've got to that thing. I don't know what an elephant is, a pachyderm, whatever, right? Let's assume that's the last element in the type hierarchy for elephant. Now you could ask, you know, well, clearly there are many siblings. There may be many other members of the subtype pachyderm, right? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So similarly, as you go up, so that's at the level of a type has many potential entities within it. If you go up the next level up on the type hierarchy, you'll get more entities and you'll also get subtypes within that type. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let's take chemistry as an example, okay? So I don't know enough chemistry to really understand this, but there are, you know, in that case, I'm a little bit confused that things may overlap. The taxonomic hierarchy is by definition a hierarchy. So is the geo-hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of administrative divisions, correct? But if we look at, for example, let's say, well, let's talk about, I don't know, countries. We might say countries that are, you know, we might think countries that are in the World Health Organization versus the United Nations versus the World Meteorological Organization. We might think of those as subtypes, but they are not in this sense. They don't form a partial order, right? They have overlapping, they're overlaps, right? So the question is, under what circumstances do we have a strict hierarchy of these things? And the things that we are calling types, we are defining to be things that live in this poset-like hierarchy, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so in chemistry, there are many things that we might naturally think of as types that do not have that characteristic, correct?
There isn't an easy answer to this. We actually started discussing this whole hierarchy things in chemistry, but it was just too complicated and the various standards were difficult. And I feel like there's even the equivalent for species. If we take different taxonomic classifications, we also don't have a unique version anymore of this. So in some sense, we have to commit to something.
But I mean, there is a really practical thing that I want out of this, and that's we have this chemical entity type that is a rather overarching thing, and we just over the years have put many properties in there, and it would be convenient if we could have subtypes.
Name some subtypes that you want.
Drugs, amino
What's
acids,
that?
drugs, right? So
radicals.
No, that's not going to work.
Wait.
Drugs is not going to work as a subtype.
Okay.
It's not a subtype. Think about it. I mean, you're going to want drugs, you're going to want hydrocarbons or something. Those overlap, but don't completely. They do not form a hierarchy. Those are descriptive tags. They're not hierarchical. In other words, there's an entity class.
Right,
That is, like if you go up to the original example, that's the winged entity.
So I generally, I see this, I mean, from a practical point of view, I want to have a property that only applies to a entity class, I guess. There are a set of properties.
Okay, well, that's a different thing than we're talking about here, because this is a hierarchy, and that's not a hierarchy. That's a different thing.
But even for countries, it's not that clear, because you can have, for example, dependencies, which we have as countries, but you might not consider sovereign countries, etc. So, and the problem is that
well, then this model is wrong.
Okay,
then this model is wrong. Right? Forget the idea of using a post set. It's not going to work. So now what happens if we say, well, so there is an enclosing type that can contain a collection of subtypes which do not form, well, which, am I right? They don't form a partial order. They certainly don't form a strict hierarchy. Am I confused here? I don't think I am. I think that you can end up with something, which is both, Is that what you're showing here?
I mean, look at this. I mean, like, it depends on if we allow the abstract ones to be present or not. If the
Okay.
abstract ones are treated on equal footing, it's no longer hierarchical.
Right. So this idea of above the elephant, there is its, family, order, whatever it is, right? That's no longer the case. There's no longer a strict hierarchy that goes up to species. And in fact, there's no guarantee that we'll have a strict hierarchy. The only thing that is the super thing is the concept of an entity itself. Right. But the problem is we've got to disambiguate the names of entities, we've got to have some kind of scoping type that does that. Otherwise, we have to have global disambiguation, which we do not want to have.
Right.
Okay. So in this case here, the thing has got to have essentially a naming hierarchy. Perhaps that's separate from its property hierarchy, so to speak. Am I making sense?
I think kind of like what Jason Biggs just said. The drugs, I feel like, is an equivalent of the abstract one.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, the hydrocarbons would be a black one.
I'm not sure about that.
The distinction there is that, I mean, you never have an orange one inheriting from two different black ones, or an entity belonging
That's
to two
correct.
different black ones at the same level.
That is correct. No. You can have a hierarchy of beads of black ones, so to speak. But you cannot, you're right, you can't have a situation in which two black ones both lead to a subsequent thing.
Right. That's exactly the discussion we had at the beginning of this meeting before you came.
Okay.
Right, and we looked at it trying to think of a hierarchy from, just like element, subatomic particles all the way up to polymers or something, but it didn't really fit the same thing.
No. Okay, look, one thing is the naming hierarchy. The other thing is the property hierarchy. Those are two pragmatic reasons for having this type hierarchy. They're not the only reasons. There are other things like, one can imagine containment, like, quarks are in protons or in carbon atoms or in whatever's, right? That's a yet different kind of hierarchy that has nothing to do with the hierarchies we're currently talking about. Am I making sense?
Agreed, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe the right way to think about it is that given that we know there are multiple kinds of hierarchies, just live with that, so to speak, and decide that, again, we have the naming hierarchy and the property hierarchy are the two obvious ones, right? I don't know where you're saving this file, but do we have a...
Yes, you had the directory.
What's it called?
Last meeting went into the entity framework folder.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what we're thinking about here is something where we are talking about we're talking about the naming hierarchy and also the property hierarchy. Now, the naming hierarchy has to be strictly, has to have this strict ordering relation. Whereas the property hierarchy, well, what happens if there are two things up here? It's winged and it's feathered. Okay? So there could be properties associated with its wingedness and properties associated with its featheredness that are both mixed in to that particular kind of entity. Am I making sense?
You mean a bird inheriting both wing properties and feather properties?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Right? So this is Okay, so I'm saying this one is a strict hierarchy, so that we get from, you know, it goes from, you know, from whatever, from bird to, I don't know what no, from hawk, a particular kind of hawk, you know, to bird, to mammal, no, not mammal, to animal, to, you know, to species, to whatever, right? And that is a naming hierarchy, which has the feature that everything below the terminal node of the naming hierarchy, or the top node of the naming hierarchy, must have a unique name within that sub tree, which is, I think, a reasonable practical thing to do, right? Whereas the property hierarchy, we're saying, in principle, you could wheel in, let's say, fins, okay, properties of fins, right? Clearly, there are mammals that have fins, and there are there are fish that have fins. And we could imagine a finned entity where those properties are available to both. So in other words, what would happen here is that for a given type, there is a list of types from which it can inherit properties, right? Otherwise known as membership, basically, of those, you know, of those types, right? Now, some of those types will be part of the naming hierarchy, some of them are not. Is this making sense?
Yes.
Okay, we have a bunch of interesting comments on our live stream here. Okay, so let's just look at a few of these, and then we're going to keep going down here. Okay, first, Marco is commenting, it would be nice if the yellow boxes had some kind of way of pulling them down to find out their properties. I fully and wholeheartedly agree. Why aren't we doing that? I brought this up about 8 times. Do you understand what I'm saying? That for example, as a user assistance thing, as soon as you hover over a yellow box, for example, you could have something here that is the analog of our information box. That, I mean, for example, here, there's absolutely no reason why this doesn't have, in fact, this is a piece of just silliness, okay? We should be able to have something here where, just like if I hover over just like if I hover over this, right? I get an eye here. Why don't I get something when I hover over this? Do you understand what I'm saying?
But not yet the actual data, just something that allows you to access the data.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we should have that, right? That's a piece of, so feed that, you know, you guys can think about that, but that also needs to be fed to the user assistance crowd.
Yeah.
And I think we just need to, you know, fatten up that tooltip there.
Yeah.
To contain that extra information. Okay, let's look at a few of these other comments. Amit says, entity itself is variable by function, constructor entity. Constructor entities as functional tuples. I don't entirely understand that. I can guess a few different possible meanings of that. Let's work as constructors before forming type entities. I don't really understand that. Bob is commenting, a house cat is both a type of pet and also a type of animal. Tomato is a type of fruit and also a type of food. Yeah, agreed. It's the same tomato. But now we're going to get into trouble there, because let's take a tomato as an example. Right? A tomato, I mean, right now, one of the issues we have, and we discussed this previously, is there's the tomato plant and there's the tomato as a piece of fruit and there's a tomato as a food. In some sense, they're all the same tomato, but in some sense, they're not. Am I making sense?
Yep.
Well,
A chicken
the
as an
plant I
animal.
would consider different.
I'm sorry?
I wonder that the plant will be different than the actual fruit or the food. The
Well,
fruit
fair
and
enough. I
food
mean, a
will be the
chicken
same
running
thing.
around is probably different as chicken as a food. And arguably gold as an element, well, that's a complicated case for metals and things, but certainly hydrogen as an element, one can distinguish from hydrogen as what? As a, I mean, well, as a compound, it would be H2, presumably. Now I'm confused. We can certainly distinguish element from chemical, even if they might have the same name.
Distinguish in which sense?
Well, I mean, so oxygen as an element is a single oxygen atom, or it represents something like the concept of a single oxygen atom. Oxygen as a chemical is presumably O2.
Correct.
Correct?
That's the molecular form of it, yes.
I'm sorry?
That's
I'm well aware of that. The question is,
okay.
if I type in, I'm well aware, if I type in entity, chemical, oxygen, okay, what is that? Okay, so is that, if I say molecule plot of that, what is it doing? There we go. Okay, hello.
So if you
So
hovered
now-
over output 5, is the canonical name molecular oxygen is my question.
No, it's not.
Or I guess
Just
it doesn't
oxygen.
canonicalize.
It's just oxygen, right?
Right, but the
Right.
entity's
So now what you're going to
canonical
see here is if I say element oxygen, right? I'm going to get a thing which represents a single oxygen atom. So if I were to say molecule plot on that, what's it going to do?
it is going to not know what to do.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
could give it the rule to do that.
No. I understand.
It
but
is not obvious to me that entity oxygen represents a single molecule. A
Single
single
molecule.
atom. A single atom.
Well,
So
in
that's
the
not
element
obvious.
case, this case, it probably should, but in this case, it's not tagging it. So these have the feature that they look the same, but they're actually different.
No, but Stephen, then like entity element for gold couldn't have a density property if it would represent a single atom.
Okay.
I mean, it's a possible viewpoint, but not one we have taken.
No, I understand that. But then what is element oxygen?
It's some
Which,
kind
as you
of
say, has a
abstraction.
density. That will have a density at standard temperature and pressure,
Yes.
which is a little bit weird because its density is really the density of a bunch of O2 molecules running around,
Indeed.
right?
Yeah, no, I agree. It is weird, but we always took some level of abstraction without.
I understand. So I'm asking chickens. Okay, so there's a difference between oxygen as an element and oxygen as a chemical. They happen to use the same English word to describe them, but they are tagged differently, just like a given word might have multiple meanings. So I think that's okay, but we have to recognize, okay, so again, this is part of our scoping types idea, right? These are in different scoping types, so they have names that are the same. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, well, let me look at a few more.
There's it's oxygen or the tomato example, food versus the fruit showed earlier. There's a non-trivial relation between them. It's not exactly the same, but it's also not totally disconnected.
I agree. On the other hand, the town called, I think there was a town called Truth or Consequences, is probably different from the television show by the same name.
Yes.
Right?
Sometimes
So
there's relation, sometimes not.
well, but there is a relation because I think the town agreed to name itself that, in return for having the television show be filmed there or something.
I see.
Right? So there's some relation, but it's hardly the same relation as a chicken as an animal and a chicken as a food. On the other hand, there are other cases where the name of something just has absolutely nothing to do with. It's purely coincidental that that combination of letters was used to represent that town in wherever, and that it also represents some different kind of thing. So, okay, so there is, I think, okay, so what we've got is the notion of things with their, their scoping type. And we could canonicalize. You are proposing effectively to canonicalize always to the scoping type. Right? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Now, that of course loses information, because given only a knowledge of what scoping type you're in, you don't necessarily know what properties you can inherit. Because the scoping type, species has no idea whether it's got wings or not.
At the type level.
But
At the
wouldn't
entity level,
properties-
we can figure it out.
Well, yeah, I understand that. But I mean, so that's the question is, does it matter that at the level of the type, we don't know what the properties are? That in order to find the properties, in order to find what properties apply, we have to go down to the level of the entity. Or actually, more accurately, we have to go down to the level of the proximal type.
Right.
Or ask the entity what types does it belong to, and then get the.
But no, obviously you can do that. But the whole point is that we're imagining that there is a strict hierarchy of naming types. Right? There's a strict naming hierarchy. So then anywhere on the naming hierarchy, you could simply ask for things with well, no, I see. So it could be the case that obviously some animals have wings and some do not. So given only that you're on that place on the naming hierarchy, you can no longer say, you can't do that except down at the lowest level, I think.
Right.
Possibly even below the lowest level. I don't even know whether. So we're saying an entity has to carry information about what abstract floating types it could inherit properties from. So for example, countries that are in, the United Nations, let's say, okay, there might be a subtype of countries in the United Nations, which is ones on the Security Council that year or something, right? So by the way, types are not static in this sense. That being an example.
No, not at all. Yeah.
So, but the naming hierarchy, okay, and that's a good argument for canonicalizing to the scoping type. Because if somebody changes, if we decide it's really important that somewhere in the chain of elephant, that we say that it's, I don't know how many toes an elephant has, but that it's really important that we consider taxonomically the thing to be a such and such toed pachyderm or something, right? And that we essentially insert an extra level in its naming hierarchy. That's, we might want to do that. Probably not for animals, but maybe for viruses, who knows? I could imagine, a change in the canonical taxonomy for viruses. Am I making sense?
Absolutely. There were recently substantial amounts of them.
Okay, fine. Well, but in that case, that's an argument for your assertion that we should canonicalize to the scoping type with respect to the name, that we should normally canonicalize to the scoping type. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
That was Tony's suggestion always.
Okay, fine. Well, I'm agreeing with that suggestion. Okay, so.
And let's see. So by canonicalizing, like when we return the entity from some entity value call or something, we return it as its canonical
yes,
canonical form.
And I would even argue that it should happen on evaluation, but we'll cross that bridge later.
Okay.
This I might disagree with, because you might want to emphasize a certain frame of something.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But okay, so you're saying certain functions will canonicalize. That's not going to work.
But
That's
entity
not gonna
value
work.
itself could do it. Entity value of entity could do it.
Okay, fair enough.
Because entity value currently, So the oxygen that you see there, the entity element or entity chemical oxygen, I was confused because I know that the canonical name of that is molecular oxygen, but the entity itself did not canonicalize it.
I don't know why. I can't tell you why. I mean, how would we even get the canonical name if that isn't it? And why didn't it canonicalize? And isn't that going to get comparisons wrong if it doesn't canonicalize?
Right. So those are good questions, but I've just, I guess it's,
Okay,
it would be a change.
let's go back. Okay, hold on. Okay, so what I like to look at some more comments on the chat here, but so what we're understanding is, given an entity, it inherits certain properties from certain. We can have a notion of a the name shouldn't be propertiferous, property-bearing type, right? A propertiferous type, so to speak. That's a really terrible name, but you understand what I'm saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? A type that has properties associated with it, as opposed to a scoping type, for example.
Yeah.
Right? Which might also have properties associated with it.
There's of course some relation between the two things.
No, I know that. A scoping type will also be a property-bearing type.
Exactly. And vice versa. The scoping types arise from the fact that many properties are identical.
Maybe.
I mean,
right,
this is what we typically call a type, things that are characterized by a certain number of properties.
I agree, but the point is that we are making a choice about a scoping type based on the naming of things that will be guided by that principle, right? That, you know, animals have certain properties in common that are different from, for example, foods.
Yeah.
But clearly that is an arbitrary human decision. What counts as a, you know, a naming type, so to speak.
But I mean, in principle, like vitamin A in an oak is a totally fine question, but an irrelevant one.
Right. Okay. Okay. Let me look at a few of these other comments on our live stream here. Marco, choosing the classification depends on the sets of properties we need to consider for the problem of hand. Yes. Yes, we agree. And I mean, there's an argument based on what Michael is saying and so on, that we say, you know, that we should have a notion of property cost, so to speak. Property can, I don't know, no. And okay, well, this is a bad name, but entity type convert. Which could potentially say, I've got an entity, it's a species, it's an elephant, but now I want to convert that. I don't know why that didn't, why it's presumably a more specialized elephant here, African or Indian or whatever. But in any case, the concept would be that entity type convert could say, attempt to convert this entity to type animal, for example.
Right.
For purposes of reframing it.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we could reuse the two entity function even for this.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Because two entity normally takes no second argument. Is that correct?
It does actually, I believe, already take a second argument.
Oh, look at that. The specified type corresponding to expert. What do you know?
But right now, expert is typically not an entity.
Right. That's the obvious thing to do with this. I agree. That's the obvious way to do this. Because the type is being specified there, same way we've specified here.
Exactly.
Now notice also that we are making an assumption here that there is no scoping of the names of types. Right?
I'm not sure if I get the meaning of the statement.
Okay, assuming names of types are global.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, they are string names.
I understand, but they're global in the sense that that means that, for example, we better not use some, as we start having these abstract types, we better not use some very standard name. I mean, we have to be careful about
Right.
the naming of those things.
Yes, yeah.
Right. So, okay, like for example, a name like density, we presumably have to have, you know, we can't say, no, that's not a type. I'm sorry. The something like, what would be a good example? Something where we could have a nasty overlap.
Building. We have it already, but it might be already.
Not sure that that's okay. The issue is two different color structure might be a better example. Two different kinds of things are considered structures, one in chemistry and one made of concrete, so to speak. Those are both type names, potentially, and they could have a nasty overlap, right? So in other words, am I making sense? So e.g.
Yeah,
structure is not likely to be a sensible type name because there are two possible meanings. Now, I claim that's going to be rare, and I claim this is a thing we should assume. I claim that the number of concepts in the world is not large enough that this is going to be a problem. I mean, clearly, right. I mean, clearly, this is a judgment call of a type we typically have to make. I think it's probably okay. All right, let's see. Approximately the defining characteristics, says James, in the absence of hierarchical subsets like a Venn diagram. Yes, that's the problem, is that things don't necessarily form a hierarchy. 4 is saying, how long before we have Platonic ideal forms? Yeah, well, I'm just writing something about this bizarre creature called the Ruliad that is deeply related to Platonic ideal forms. But that's a few layers of abstraction above this. Is my cat, asks Bob, a type of cat or an instance of the type cat? No, it's an instance of the type cat.
I mean, that's actually a good question. And this has come up over the years from time to time where we go to this absolute end of being unique. Like for persons, there's just literally a single one. But for the species hierarchy, we add we add even basically before subspecies. For some things, we go to subspecies, but we never go to the concrete item.
Well, okay. Humans happen to be given names, which are not necessarily unique. But we have the idea that in the current state of the world and so on, a human is a unique, identifiable, distinct concept.
Yeah.
I suspect, the unnamed fish in the school of fish is a little bit less obviously, then it's a less obvious thing.
But you might have the two-headed snake that makes it in the news.
What happens with a two-headed snake? That's an interesting question for poor Siamese twins and things. Presumably they get separated names.
Fortunately, that's in Alan's court.
Is Alan here?
Thanks. I can't remember offhand how we've handled Siamese twins in people data. I'd have to go in and look at Chang and Eng or whoever else we might have in there.
Okay, this is, I'm just going to make a note.
Typically the known ones do the,
each member has each separate mind.
Each head has
You broke up, Alan. Okay. Dane is saying, Maybe classify different types of hierarchies, find a set of useful ones. Yeah, I think this is what we're ending up realizing.
Yeah.
Bob, sometimes something has a type only if there can be more than one of them. Do we agree? Type of all red things, as opposed to the set of all things which are not members of themselves. Right. I don't think a type necessarily has to have more than one of it. I mean, like, for example, among chemicals, we could say, we could imagine a type that is, radioactive elements below such and such, and only technetium qualifies. I don't think there's anything, and even there could perfectly well be a type that somehow we specify which has nothing in it. For example, it could be the case that we have a type that we specified, which is members of the such and such alliance of countries. And the such and such alliance blows up, and there are no members of it in the future. Yet, I mean, what do we do with that type? Presumably the type still exists, and the statement about the world is there are now no members of this. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, BTC is saying, what is a thing? Oh, wow. It's a type of foliation with properties, categories, relations, and causal relations. Oh boy. Those are two different parts of my brain. Let's see if we can connect these. Has anybody, a curiosity question, in the world of sparkleism, so to speak, has that been described a bunch in terms of category theory? Anybody know? I can certainly imagine how it could be done. I'm not sure it's terribly natural.
Didn't I not forward you some paper about this a couple of months ago, Tony?
Yeah, there's some formalization mathematical, but I don't know the details.
I mean, I think one of the issues is, so one of the questions will be, is there any way to transport, it's like proof to proof
I put in the
transformations.
chat, yeah, I found it again.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, clearly you can formulate, just like you can formulate relational algebra and things for databases and so on, you can clearly formally make up certain things like that. Whether that's useful or not is unclear. My belief would be that the place where it gets interesting is if you can transform, if you've got one branch here and it transforms to another branch, there is some correspondence between branches, like proof-to-proof transformations in proof structures, then that would get interesting. And my guess is that's not going to happen here. That is that the case would be two parallel hierarchies that somehow map onto each other in some natural way. Can we imagine that? Well, we could imagine, yes.
At least there's a homomorphism.
Yes.
Not as an isomorphism.
Probably. But I mean, so for example, the hierarchy, here's an example. The family, phylum, family, order, that whole thing is applied both to plants and animals. Am I making sense? So in other words, we happen to have the same hierarchy. And by the way, oh, I see. No, wait a minute. That's a meta type. The order is a meta type, is a name of okay. So we also have the notion, I think, of meta types, e.g. phylum, for example, is a meta type. And we might very well want to be able to tag, when we name a thing, we might want to say the phylum, blah, blah, blah. Am I making sense? In addition, I mean, that might also help with naming issues. You see what I'm saying?
Not fully.
Okay, so look, the issue is, let's say we have, I just don't know let's do, let's do it in terms of countries, okay? We'd say, the country Singapore. no, let's take the administrative division, ADM1. Let's say we're just doing administrative divisions. ADM1, Singapore, ADM2, Singapore, so to speak. Those are potentially, this is a bad example. That's a bad example. No, it's a bad example. What I'm looking for is, in looking at plants, okay, we can say this plant is a member of this phylum. This plant is a member of this order. In looking at animals, we can say this animal is a member of this phylum. This animal is a member of this order. The concept of phyla and orders are in common between the animal and plant types. Am I making sense?
Yep.
But those are not themselves types. Phylum itself is not a type. It is merely a type of type. Am I making sense?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Right. So there's always a concrete phylum, but the whole point is a tagging of a type of type, some kind of meta type. And that was what I was saying earlier. I think it might be useful to allow the possibility of tagging types, if only just as a courtesy, so that you kind of know at what level, oh, that's the, the order, what is it, Squamata for lizards and snakes or something, if I remember correctly, but below reptilia. Am I making sense? So you're saying reptilia, what's that? Yes,
So somehow
no?
that mean like the types itself are in entities?
In some
Well, yes.
abstract way, yes.
Yes, and so there certainly could be properties of the types. So that's a properties of types as which serve, I don't see why we shouldn't have properties of types. But I think we're going to need some kind of way of, yeah, okay, so that's a separate issue here.
We already have them, right? For example, you can have the count or the entity count.
I see
as
what
a
you're
property of a type.
saying. Yeah, I
Identity
understand.
value.
That makes sense, right? Okay, that makes sense. But are those? But we don't have that. If I say entity type of country, no, wait a minute. What is the tagging? How do I get an entity type? Wait a minute. I thought oh, I see. We reserved that. I remember us.
Yeah.
The concept of an entity type is something we do not yet have. That could be the fully decorated form of country, for example, could be entity type country. Am I making sense?
But we have entity country only.
No, I understand. I'm saying when we write entity country, that's a string name, right? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It could be that the fully decorated form of that is entity type, country, blah, blah, blah. And that could have some other tagging. But in other words, the entity type construct could be the symbolic representation that represents that whole type of thing. Now, the alternative would be to have an entity that is of type, and to do this. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Such an entity type object might be useful in order to discover relations between types.
Yes, I think that's quite possibly true, although we could also do it using the entity type. Okay, let's go back.
So that entity type object could also contain.
What's that?
You're very faint, James.
Sorry, the entity type object could contain sublevels within it.
Yeah,
like so, it
I agree.
represent animal, but it could also contain the fact that it is a taxonomic species, that kind of thing. If that.
Yes, that's correct. It could be much more decorated. And even if you ask for the entity type somehow, well, okay, it can be a more decorated version. Okay. So let me see. Properties being some decidable function that assigns some semantic aspect to a region of space-time. Oh boy. I don't think, I mean, not to get too philosophical on it, but I don't think everything is in a region of space-time. I think there are plenty of concepts that we have about minds that can't be physicalized in that sense. But we can still discuss it, even though it's not, or in mathematics, we can say, the group SU3 is not a region of space-time. It is an abstract thing. So I don't think we can physicalize at that level. Bob is suggesting, could we use fuzzy logic? When does a fin become an arm? You see, the problem here is we have a descriptive language and we have sort of the state of the world. And in a sense, what we do when we use language, okay, the world has some form. Atoms are arranged in some way. We talk about those things in terms of a much reduced description where we just say it's an object. I pick up my water glass or something. And clearly, the definition of that water glass is a complicated thing with all kinds of atoms falling off it and things being stuck on it and all kinds of things like that. But we choose to use the linguistic description, a glass, for example. And what we're dealing with here is trying to describe the world at the level of linguistic descriptions, not trying to describe the world at the level of the way it actually is. And so, we would probably say, we will say, what would be a good example? We'll say the town of such and such. That's a bad example because that's defined. I mean, in a sense, what legal systems have a habit of doing is trying to make essentially a linguistic description of real things in the world. Like you say, the town of such and such. Okay, what really is that? Well, there might be a certain collection of atoms that are, a certain region of space-time, a certain coordinate system, whatever, but this is going to get defined as something which is then going to be linguistically referred to. So I think, okay, that doesn't really answer the question of fins versus arms. What happens?
I guess it's much more a thing of it's a good question. We see them a lot in some query streams. It's often more a matter of definition. And some society makes the definition if it's a fin or an arm.
Well, what do you mean? I mean, so look, imagine what was that creature called, the thing that crawled out of the ocean in the Carboniferous period or something.
Yeah.
I forget what that was called, but it had fins that turned into legs.
Right.
What were those things? Were they fins? Were they legs? If we say how many legs did whatever that creature was called have, what should we do? Should we, for that creature, inherit both fins and legs? A 4 or something for the count of them.
I would think some paleontology society made a decision and named it either this or this. It's not
okay. So Michael is following the legal theory of these things. But linguistically, if somebody asks at the NLU level, how many legs did a such and such have? Surely we want to be able to answer that.
Right.
I'm going to write down the fins versus legs. Somebody can look up what the creature was called. See, I would argue that a different approach would be to say, let it inherit leg properties as well as fin properties. Why not? Like a fin might have something to do with its
That might be as confusing, webbing. Like the thing has 4 fins and 4 legs.
Oh, you mean, gosh, right. But the fact that the fins and the legs are the same things.
Exactly. We lose the identification. We need a non-trivial machinery to identify them.
I see. Are the 4 fins the same as the 4 legs? Okay. that's a good question for wings, right? I mean, it could be the case that if you're a let's imagine that you're a convertible car plane object, and the ends of your wings have wheels on them, and you put them down on the ground, and then it's that will get super confusing. But again, we can't describe the semantics, the pragmatics of something, of how things are. We can only describe, what we're trying to do is to find a linguistic description of things, as opposed to a sort of a material description of things. And we're going to end up in Aristotle's crazy thing, which I've never believed in, about material forms and formal, what is it? I can't even remember that hierarchy. The causes, right? Material causes, formal causes, etc. It is a bit embarrassing that we're back to a 2,000-year-old issue, but I guess that's the nature of things. Because I mean, that is as I recall, the Aristotelian hierarchy, so to speak. Anybody remember what that is? Aristotelian. Well, I don't know how to spell it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anybody know what I'm talking about?
I have a diffuse understanding, but no.
Okay, so I think it's like the material, it's a thing, it's made of something. Material, the formal cause, I forget one of them, and then the final cause, which has to do with what it's for. And I think that's what we're kind of trying to talk about here with respect to things. And I suspect that we have a different, we will pragmatically need a different slicing of things than that. Okay. Marco is suggesting check the bridge design pattern. It decouples hierarchies of properties where they has a relationship. Okay, perhaps somebody can look that up. Tony, can you do that, please?
Yeah.
Fukamen says, it is possible for a given chemical to be a drug and a pesticide, so the hierarchy isn't clear. Yes, I agree. BTC, better a thing or an object is a subset. Yeah, the subset of spatial hypergraphs and so on. I don't think there is, this is a linguistic description of things. This is not a physicalized description of things. Oh boy, we have tons of comments here. Wow, okay. Well, it's a complicated topic. Fu is saying for the density example, diamond and graphite have different densities, but they're carbon, yes, indeed. BTC is commenting that fixed point of the head function on something eventually goes to symbol, the symbol. Now it being discussed as a type. Yes, indeed. That's the, that unfortunately is the way that things end up working. It's like, it is similar to, in the evaluation world, to quote the quote of the quote, so to speak. It's interesting, actually, the way that there's a, well, anyway. Okay, BTC is commenting, convert the red color of a piece of material to red color of a charge of quark. Yes, but that's not a type, I think. I mean, I think we will be foolish to have those types of things as types, I think. Yes, BTC is commenting, evolution, another part of rulal space, how whether the subject, object, verb, etc., structure and the way that we identify objects and so on is unique. And the answer is undoubtedly no. Our market at the present time is humans in the 21st century. So therefore, we are catering to the description that humans in the 21st century use of the world, which, by the way, is probably different from the description it's a little different than description. For example, one time when people were trying to do something like this was the philosophical languages developed in the 1600s, and they had slightly different descriptors, although fairly similar to ours. But we can imagine at some time in the future, yeah, this notion of identifying objects, types of objects, and so on, that is a pretty human thing, and certainly not a necessary feature of how we describe the world. But we are, we're in the business of providing things for humans of the 21st century, so that's what we have to do. And it is arbitrary, but the generality is nothing. It's like saying, I mean, in this theory of my Rulliad concept, the only way you can understand it is by coordinatizing it, which is essentially what we're talking about doing here. Abstract entities like happiness and hope. Yes, there are abstract entities. Absolutely, there are abstract entities. I mean, do you guys agree that there are, in this setup that we're dealing with, there absolutely can be things that do not physicalize, right?
Yes.
Right, we have already now a physical system. There isn't an abstract tilted plane in the world.
Yeah, fair enough.
And we have words also, word data.
Yeah.
So words
Yeah,
are
okay.
concepts. So.
Fair enough. Okay.
Group data.
Right. Let's see. ETC and electron. Electron on the surface of a snake, the air surrounding it. Yeah, when does it become the air and when does it become the snake? When the snake takes a breath, when does the molecule become a part of the snake as opposed to a part of the air? That is why I am saying we are merely making a linguistic description of the world, not a kind of material description of the world. There must be uninhabited types. I agree that there must be. Okay, that's interesting. So BTC is commenting, parallel matching across categories is like a metaphor. That is, commenting that the word metaphor is from the Greek word to carry across, metaphero, presumably. That's an interesting, I mean, again, we're not going to capture metaphor in the poetic sense. The question of whether, I mean, that's an interesting term. I mean, maybe functors should have been called metaphors in category theory. Never mind that. Let's see. 4 is saying, I think there are going to be far fewer true type hierarchies in the world than it would seem. Again, I think that Michael's legal, the legal concept of types, which is in a sense, the quotes, the legal concept of types is an idealization of the linguistic concept of types, right? It's some kind of idealization of when we.
It's kind of like a certain disambiguation.
Yes.
Where there were various possibilities, but IUPAC said, this is what we do.
Right. So in that form, in the legal concept of types, there will be strict hierarchies, just by definition. Now, things may be goofy there.
Right.
But such as, so it goes. I mean, there will be, and I mean, there is an issue, which I think we're slightly glossing over, of what happens if it changes. What do we believe is the canonical permanent anchor? Let's imagine that it turns out people discover that there are 2 kinds of Indian elephants, let's say. No doubt that people already know that. But actually, great example is lymphocytes, right? Back when I was a kid, all you learned was that there were red and white blood cells. Now there are a gazillion different types of lymphocytes. And so there's a question, and maybe somebody will say, oh, that was incorrectly classified. What do we do with, what is our policy on, the CD8 positive, helper T cell, whatever thing, whatever all the names are? How do we grandfather that? Do you see what I'm
No,
saying?
It's like the 2 stars that only now we see as 2 and that were classified as 1 star earlier.
Yes,
Mm.
that's right. What do we do?
Every few years we update to the latest.
Okay, but what do we do with it? What do we do with something that says, let's imagine that there's a Proxima Centauri, there's an Alpha Centauri D or something that's discovered. Well, that's not so difficult. A new thing discovered is one thing. The issue is, 2 species break in, 1 species breaks into 2. I mean, we always, okay, we already have
becomes
this
a minor
issue with,
planet, right?
yes, right. Planet becomes a minor planet. Or more to the point, we have a country that breaks in 2. South Sudan,
we
whatever
already
else.
have that case.
I know we have
Exactly.
that case. So what do we
Exactly
do with
that
that case? So then
But I feel like that's not a problem. The problem where something changes at the entity level, this happens all the time. As we said earlier, they are time dependent. The problem is if some types go away through to further scientific progress.
Wait a second. But what happens to, there was a concept of Sudan, presumably. And we've had this issue with historical countries, right? There's a concept of Sudan, but then it breaks into, I don't know whether there's one surviving entity that's called Sudan and one that's called South Sudan, or I don't know how that was done. But
Yes,
you get what I'm saying.
That was okay.
Okay, but so the question is, there might be a surviving entity, but who knows? Maybe Macedonia or something kept. Who knows? I mean, I'm misremembering history and so on, but we could imagine that something kept the name. I mean, it happens with companies all the time. That there's a good company name that some much smaller sub entity takes, and the main part of the company becomes something different. See what I'm saying? And so the question is then, for us, if we have, okay, so let's imagine we have, I saw Facebook decided to rename itself today, but we have a company, and boy, this is confusing. I mean, that case is really ugly because, there could have been a previous company that went out of business long ago that was called, I think Facebook's renaming itself Meta, right? Reminds me of Howard Hughes, right? Had a company called Summa. So, who knows? Although I think that was of a slightly different character. But in any case, I mean, a previous name, what do we do with that? We have a canonical entity that's called Summa, for example, which existed in the 1950s, let's say, disappears, goes out of business. Then a new company comes on the scene, no trademark issue. They name themselves Summa. What happens to our entity, canonical entities? That's a question for Alan, I think. Is Alan still with us?
I would say kind of like we have we move it over to some historical company, and the current one is always whatever it is.
Fair enough. Well, this is an issue. Again, Alan should speak to this, but this is an issue that's obviously come up with historical countries. How do we deal with this? Okay. Okay, let's see. BTC is commenting, when there are directed and undirected relations and those beyond 2 edges, a hypergraph seems better for categorization of the conceptual world. Look, guys, let me say it again. It's never going to work, as in, there is no perfect way, the world as it is, defined in terms of our universe with its whatever it is, 10 to the 10 to the some number of, ultimate atoms of space or whatever. There is, we think now, an ultimate description of our universe, but it is utterly irrelevant to what we're actually dealing with here. And when you try and put the screws on the way that we actually describe things as humans and think about things, it is always going to fall apart. There's just simply no, you can add a certain level of precision that allows you to do certain kinds of reasoning. And beyond that, it's, you're descending, the best you can do probably is to capture sort of what a reasonable person would think you meant. Clearly you say a dog has 4 legs, but there's a 3-legged dog out there. Or, any of these kinds of things. There's always this is not a, there's a notion of useful reasoning about the world. It's the same thing in mathematics. I mean, for example, the fact that we say that 0 times x is equal to 0 is something where you could say, no, that's not always true. What if x is infinity? But it's still a very reasonable thing to do, to say that 0 times x is 0, even though in the sort of ultimate description of even mathematics, that's not the case. So I think it's anybody who thinks, I mean, what we have done, for example, with Wolfram Alpha and now with the Wolfram language, with all these frameworks we're talking about here, is we're trying to make a reasonable, good judgment approximation to how the world works, which is not to say that we're going to get everything precisely right, because I claim that's impossible. I know maybe Michael wants to make a philosophical comment about this too.
No, I totally agree. I mean, why do we do this? Because we want to do practical things, like we want to find, I don't know, metabolic scaling laws and such things. And so a convenient way to access the data at a certain level is what is practically useful. I don't think that this hierarchy that we build will on its own progress the world.
Yeah. Right. No, it's okay, fair enough. Yeah, 4 says, I prefer to think labels we put on things as something more like the output of a clustering algorithm than fuzzy boundaries. Yes, I agree. It's like the meaning of words. Words which develop multiple meanings, you could potentially see, if you think about word, meaning space, you'll gradually see those clusters of instances of the use of the word separate in meaning space. Oh boy, so many comments here. Okay, let's see. Eli is asking, so in the case of types, what would speciation be like homomorphic paths between different biological structures the animal could possibly evolve towards? Morphic paths. Well, okay, so we're talking about, I mean, yeah, this is what we're talking about evolution of types. Speciation, I mean, I guess we can describe it in terms of these type hierarchy paths. Okay, let's see. Comment from Uncomp. A set is defined by its members. There exists a set which contains all globally defined types as distinct from any other named entity which doesn't have to be a type. Set is more primitive than global types. Oh, no. This is going to get us into another morass of, you see, this is the problem with all of these global theories of things. So the claim being made here is a set is more general than a global type, which is more general than a name. A set also has a name. Mathematica is axiomatic in having globally defined a unique type name rather than a more primitive symbolic set of names without types. More primitive. I'm not getting that. I mean, the fact is, the hack on which Wolfram language and so on is based is the hack that you can name things with words that are sort of English-like words. That is not a necessary hack. That is, in principle, if the system was being used by computers, there is no reason to have a name like plus. It could simply be the symbol 7426. That would be just fine if all you're trying to do is to make abstract reasoning. I mean, it reminds me of the Hilbert. What did Hilbert say about mathematical concepts, that they could as well be tables and chairs or something? I don't remember that. There's some quote along those lines. But yeah, you know, we're essentially using the hack of connecting to English, which is a way to connect to the way that humans view the world, which is not the abstract way the world is or could be. It is merely the way that in the 21st century, we humans choose to think about it. It actually is. Maybe there's no the way it actually is. Yeah, BTC is commenting. There is no the way it actually is. It's the way I described in my reference frame. Yeah. Yes. I mean, what is a definition? A definition is merely the tag that we choose to put on something. And then the question is, does that definition somehow maintain some consistency? Okay, Fu is saying mud skippers can walk. Yeah, actually, now that you mention it, yes. Those appendages are still fins and not legs. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, so long as somebody defines them as fins in Michael's legal concept of types, we might still be okay. Okay, let's see. 4 is saying, build the categories dynamically, assign all the properties to entities from human literature, then group them according to people, how actually people talk about them. Well, that's kind of what we're trying to do. I mean, we're trying to curate this whole thing from the actual practicality of what people say. Yes, but Fu is now descending into the mud on the saying, use the generic term appendage rather than fin and leg. Yes, but therein lies the path to not to, you know, drive the mud skipper too far. But, you know, by the time you're doing that, you say, you know, by the time you're genericizing at that level, you will rapidly lose the ability to connect it to anything that people actually think about. I mean, that's the, you know, that has been one of the mistakes sometimes in science, is to try and genericize things to the point where nobody can understand what you're talking about. Okay, let's see. 4 is saying, perhaps we could borrow concepts from functional programming GUIs to deal with changes in hierarchy, i.e. explicitly model time. I don't quite get that. Oh boy, Parmenides is commenting. Goodyear Tires was started by Charles Goodyear, the person, but went bankrupt. Another company took his tires and now has the current Goodyear. Yeah, right. Right, BTC is commenting that our entity database might be part of the future Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so we should get this right. We're going to do the best we can, but let's remember, this is, you know, the abstract thing about the universe. The universe does what it does. What we care about is our description of the universe. And that's what we're trying to capture. We are trying to sort of put in a bottle the implicit theory of knowledge of the 21st century human civilization, and which is a little different than saying, let's describe how all the atoms of space work. It's saying, let's describe things that the 21st century human cares about. And by the way, the 22nd century human might have, you know, by that, you know, by the time there's a, you know, your average augmented reality world looks quite different. People end up with a completely different description, you know, even different object borders and things like that, because, you know, if you're not seeing invisible light, you might conclude different things about what counts as an object, and so on and so on and so on. One can imagine all kinds of bizarre differences, but that's not what we're trying to capture. We're simply trying to sort of put in a bottle the current way that we think about things, which I think is significant enough. But if we try to go further, we end up with nothing. Let's see. 4 is saying, I think as much as possible, we should try to stick to the mapping of well-defined blob of computer data to messy world of language, because the reverse is much, much harder. But we have to do the reverse because people type things in. People expect to talk to their computers and say messy linguistic things. And what we've done rather successfully with Wolfram Alpha and our NLU system, which it was not self-evident would work, is we have, we do pretty good automatic disambiguation. We thought that we would have to do much more structured, much more tiresome, much more human asking questions disambiguation. But the nature of a complete query tends to correctly capture, the disambiguation most of the time. So it turns out that language, while messy and while it has many, many corner cases, is most of the time the central part of language does fairly well and is fairly easy to disambiguate, though there are corner cases and you will never be able to stamp out the corner cases. Okay, let's see. Descriptive category rather than a prescriptive category, you can still extract those facts from your category. Well, yes, that's this issue about whether we're talking about naming a naming type or a property bearing type. Okay, so BTC is commenting that OpenCog uses hypergraphs. Years ago we've interacted with these various common sense knowledge folk, and the answers were the conclusions were always unfortunate. In the sense that we really wanted to try and make use of all the work that's been done in those areas. And for example, one we looked at in particular was solving math word problems, where you ask a question like, Jim has, 6 marbles and puts 2 in a bag. How many marbles does he have out now? Things like that would be a question of sort of common sense reasoning, but we never managed to make that work. What is answer set programming from logic programming? Well, so again, logic programming is yet a different kind of thing which we understand fairly well now in terms of this whole multi-way graph, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a thing where you're saying, you've got a multi-way graph of lots of possibilities, go find the one that satisfies some particular goal requirement. And I don't think I mean, maybe there will be an issue along those lines in these type hierarchies of, will there be an issue like that? I don't know, you could imagine a somewhat made up thing of, find me a thing whose subtype is, yeah, I could imagine something where you say, find me a path to things with wings. Find me a path in the type hierarchy that leads me to entities which have wing properties. Anyway, I'm not sure. Okay, we are really over time here, but okay, let's see. Marco is saying, suggestion is simply an entity should have other entities which can also be types. Right, well, this is a question of whether a type is a type of entity. All right, what else did you guys want to cover here? We've gone deeply philosophical here, but I think, what is this down here?
Well, this was the same we looked at last time. The question was, how do we name the relation between types, one being below the other? Yeah.
What do you mean by below? We just agreed that wasn't a notion. I mean, in other words, we've got the naming types, which do form a hierarchy, and we've got the property-bearing types, which can have a more complicated relationship, where there can be multiple parents for a given thing, right?
Yeah.
So what's the question here?
I think here concretely one for if you have a custom entity store and you have say the naming hierarchy and you have one down, what is the string key on the left hand side? Okay,
so I'm going to make
it's
the claim.
Very specific.
I know. I'm going to make the claim this is the wrong way to do it. I'm going to make the claim that the diagram you had at the top, that if you want a hierarchy set up, well, okay. So my first claim is going to be you should explicitly declare that hierarchy setup. You should have a symbolic structure here that represents that type hierarchy, independent of the specifics of, a particular type. But you're going to say, why not? Okay, so one possibility is from the outside, describe the type hierarchy. Another possibility is from within a type, talk about how it lives relative to other types.
I mean, practically, like I feel like there are slightly different scenarios. For us as the provider of the whole Wolfram knowledge base, obviously we have a very complicated and big hierarchy. But if you have your own entity store, you might just have 2 levels deep with 3 different things.
All right. So, but the question is, there's one fully decorated form, which is the descriptor inside the entity store that describes the type hierarchy in that entity store. And I think there should be a way of specifying that is not that different from that graph you had at the top of this notebook. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
But now the question is, what is the...
It seems overly verbose and complicated.
Well, yes,
like it could be derived from,
I know, but I'm saying that's the fully decorated form.
Yeah,
right. It's similar to like a type environment in some other department in the company, right?
Well, yes, it probably is. It's probably similar. And we should probably find out how that works in the compiler, how that type environment description language works. And perhaps we could use the same thing here. But in any case, that's from the outside. That's the disembodied, fully decorated, how types relate to each other, symbolic description. The separate thing is the sort of cheaper version of this, where from within a type, you're just saying, hey, I want to grab all the properties from this other thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think the mistake that's being made here, okay, is that you've got 2 types of types. One is the naming types, and the other is the property-bearing types. And I think that you have to distinguish those here.
When you're writing the thing out, though, I mean, it's convenient when you're writing it out. Like they could all kind of seem like property types, or maybe.
Well, okay, then you can declare them somehow. You say this is a naming type. This is a scoping type. You got to tell it that somewhere. You've either got to tell it that at a top level, sort of from the outside. This is the type specification. This is the type hierarchy from the outside, or you could say from inside a type, you wave a flag and say, I'm a naming type. Am I making sense? Because somewhere it's got to know that. And the subtype of, I think that has got to refer to, there's 2 different possible meanings there. This is the thing that is the naming inheritance, or this is the thing that is property inheritance.
I think
and I don't think subtype.
With respect to entity stores, I think it will be virtually always properties.
Maybe. I don't agree with you. I think that the naming.
You have your own set of data from your research, and it's virtually always property based.
Maybe. Okay, but I think the term subtype is super confusing.
Yeah, that's why we wanted to change it.
Right. Well, so
something else
it's
you
basically
might not like,
property inheritance.
Right, inherits from, but
yeah.
Well, no, but it's not inherit. It's properties from, property source, property.
It's properties too.
Well, okay, but this is we don't like to have that such a big sentence fragment, So what we're dealing with, okay, so this is entity store design. And what we're saying here, so the question is, what should this be called? This is the thing that, okay, so one thing is basically name it's not predecessor. What is the base? It's basically name base.
Name parent?
Yeah, that's probably closer. Right. But it couldn't be more than one of these. Name parent types. Because there could be more than one, couldn't there? No, that's the ultimate. There's one is the ultimate enclosing scoping type. Canonical name. Actually, there is a notion of a canonical type, right? The thing that the thing canonicalizes to. Is that making sense?
Yes, but I'm not sure how this helps here.
Well, but you need that information. What this type ultimately canonicalizes to. So for example, when you register an entity store and you discover that something with that canonical type clashes in name with something else that goes to the same canonical type, you've got to generate a message.
Yes.
Right?
But it's kind of not the average scenario.
No, I know that, but you've got to have a canonical type. You've got to know what the canonical type is. And then, look, basically what this is there's a notion of a type path, which leads you to the canonical type.
Right.
Type naming path or type path. You know, how you get up to the canonical, up to a higher named type, because it could be like kind of the, you know, like DNS or something. You know, in other words, you're not getting quite to, you know, eventually you get to the .com domain, so to speak, but you could be your type naming path. Look, what you want is a type from which, okay, look, there's basically a type from which you inherit
Exactly.
naming rights or naming characteristics. And then there's the type, and that's a single type. No, it's not a single type. It's a single chain of types. Single chain of types, right?
There's always one correct, yeah.
And at the end, there's a canonical type, which is the end of the line. Okay. And then the second concept is types plural from which you inherit properties. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for entity stores, like really the data you have in your lab, this is probably the more common one.
Okay, well, I'm not convinced of this. I'm really not convinced, but I think we need both of them. So
I have a question though. I mean, in the graph that Tony showed, you had airplane kind of showed up out of nowhere because it inherited from this winged entities, and but other than that, I mean, isn't one of the distinctions between the property namespaces versus the naming namespaces are that one brings entities to it, right? So the abstract types have properties, but they don't bring new entities.
why not?
Right,
Why
I
not?
agree.
Wait a minute. Why do you agree? I mean, why isn't there a way of asking, give me all the winged entities?
Yeah, you can ask that, but
it's, I mean, well, it's still, they are all of its types, all of its entities are concrete entities of a different concrete
Not necessarily.
type.
Not necessarily. The winged type could have, you know, a kind of a feathered winged type or a scaly winged type or something.
But I would say every entity in the winged type category belongs to a concrete type.
I agree.
Yes, of course it does. It belongs
So
to a
in the
type which has
entity
the naming
store-
hierarchy.
In the
For
entity
which-
store,
yeah.
when you put out these types, there will be those types which have entities which are new and those types which
I know,
don't.
I know. That's the point I was making about this naming based types versus property, name carrying types versus property carrying types. See what I'm saying? And of name carrying types have a very straightforward inheritance hierarchy. Property carrying types are more complicated. Now, you could give things in terms of property carrying types. There might be an overlap. There might be somebody who's both a musician and a painter. Where do you put them? Right? Now, you could say, let's just be fuzzy and just generate an error if Anna appears both as a musician and a painter. Right? And only not generate an error if in the type hierarchy, you have something like this, where this is, I mean, these things, I don't think you should be using. Okay, it is merely a courtesy to use property-bearing types as things in which you can name entities.
Correct.
Right, and you can tangle yourself up in a mess there by having overlapping things and so on. Right, so let's see. So what we want here, okay, so I think we should describe what the canonical form is. I mean, what the sort of the fully decorated standardized form is, and then worry about what the elisions for convenience are. Okay?
Yeah.
And to my mind, there should be a declaration of every entity within a name-based type, a name-bearing type. Okay, so we have this notion, we named them differently above, but name-bearing types and property-bearing types. Okay, so the claim is that every entity must appear in a name-bearing type, and it is an error if it appears, it should appear only in, well, we could put it into, yeah, I mean, again, in terms of the entry, the canonical version, it should presumably, what is the canonical version of the entity store? Is it that it appears in its proximal name-bearing type? Do you understand what I mean by that? Yes? No? You understand what I mean? So,
yeah, I feel like it's a nearly irrelevant question. It's like, what's the canonical form of a time series? Typically,
all right, fine.
Shouldn't look inside.
All right, okay, fine. But then the question is, can it appear, can Anna, as she does here, appear in two, I mean, is musician a name-bearing type?
No.
Okay, fine. All right, so person, okay, is there any, with respect to people, are there any name-bearing types other than the person category? Than the person type?
In that entity store, no.
No, I'm saying in our knowledge base, is there a name-bearing type for people other than the people type, person type?
So at the moment, we have only name-bearing types, and then we might have sports people.
Okay, which is wrong. Which is wrong. I think the name-bearing type from, well, I mean, I think the feature of a name-bearing type is that it does have to have a strict hierarchy. It has to have a strict subset relation. Do you agree?
But if it has no relation, then it's still a name-bearing type, right?
Sure. But if there are multiple name-bearing types, if there's a hierarchy of name-bearing types, they must be in a strict subset relation to each other. Right?
Yes.
Okay, as opposed to property-bearing types, which are a free-for-all. But a property-bearing type lives underneath the name-bearing type. That is, a property-bearing type has a parent name-bearing type. Does that make sense?
This was not the case for the original diagram we started with. Like the winged entity
right, okay, fair
has
enough.
no name.
Maybe it's wrong. Okay, all right, fine. Maybe it doesn't have to. I mean, the property bearing type then could just be, I'm giving you these various random types. And when I refer to those types with entity property, I refer to them using the name of that property bearing type.
Right.
And I can just associate any random, I mean, if there turns out to be a property of, you know, time to balance a ball on its nose type thing, that could be applied to both a seal and a robot or something. Completely different kinds of things, completely differently in the name-bearing type hierarchy, but nevertheless having the same property attached to them. Is that correct? Is that correct?
I think so. Tony?
Okay.
Sorry, say that again.
Okay, I'm not going to say it again because I think we ran way over time here. So, I mean, do you think you have a path forward here?
Yes.
Why don't we, I mean, we got to clean up. I mean, basically what's going to happen here is I don't know how canonical you're going to need this. I mean, I think we understand how these things get attached. And I think we understand that there are a bunch of error conditions in the entity store itself or in the registration of an entity store, right? And we got to be able to detect those of things that, you know, are inconsistent. Otherwise, you know, I really do think that there's okay. So for example, you know, this is a question of how you store it, and I don't know, but, you know, for a given entity, just saying, give me all the properties this entity has, that's clearly going to be an important thing to have. And, you know, I think the sort of the rows and columns case, give me all properties a given entity has, is going to be very useful. Give me all entities that have a given property is going to be somewhat less useful, but nevertheless important. And both have to be easily accessible. Am I making sense?
As it was in the third example in the entity section in Tony's notebook.
Yeah, okay, fine. Fine. So long as there's an efficient way to do that, we're all good. But so here, the question is, if you want to pull in, okay. I just don't understand how, I mean, I don't understand this. What's the point of this? Why do you even care? In other words, if you're simply declaring that this instrument played, what you're trying to do is you're trying to scope that property name to say that that property name is one that came from this property bearing type. Because property names are not distinct except within a given property bearing type. Correct? So really the only role that this has is to say, I mean, I don't understand what role that has. Is what that's doing to associate this Anna with that Anna here?
Exactly. So it
Okay, but
basically
that's a different role. Then
yes, so it adds one edge in the graph, on the first graph on the whole notebook.
yeah, I understand, but it's saying that it's simply saying one of the properties of Anna. One of the properties of that. Yeah,
One of the property of Anna the musician rather than Anna the pet, which could also be another type.
I know, but so right. But I mean, the fact is, this is saying that a musician should have a birthplace, even though we might not know what it is.
Right.
And so when we return, I mean, so one way to think about that is when we say birthplace of Anna the musician, we would say missing, not available, not missing, not applicable. Am I making sense?
Yep.
And that's in a sense what that's doing for one.
Yes.
Okay, so, well, I agree that in terms of, okay, one thing is the inheritance of properties, which really isn't on a whole type basis. Right? Every individual entity could inherit different properties if it wanted to. The only role of declaring it globally for a given type here is namespacing the property names, I claim.
So do we want individual entities to inherit different properties?
But they could. If you said entity property of blah, 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 you should be able to inherit from wherever you want to. Do you see what I'm saying? The point is that, look, the role, okay, two roles of, quotes, subtype of. Role one, what is the name-bearing type hierarchy? I.e., you know, what properties should there inevitably be? Should there always be? Right? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So we better not put in as properties of a person, the generic base person, what books they've written. Well, maybe we could. No, we could do that. We could do that. We just simply say missing, not available, because a person can write a book. Any person could write a book. But if we put in, something, I don't know, number of, well, okay. So, okay. What is the name-bearing type hierarchy? What properties should there always be? And the second thing is namespacing of properties specified for this entity, for the entities given here, right? That makes sense?
Yes.
And I could imagine, I could imagine wanting multiple ones of those. So I mean, basically, property sources or property property sources, property source types, something like that. Property source types would be the namespace thing. That would be a list of things where if you see a name here, you go look it up in its fully qualified form as entity property of that type, comma, whatever. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now here in the name-bearing hierarchy, well, this is much closer to subtype of, because it does have to be hierarchical. It could even be just called supertype. Goes to whatever.
Yes.
Or parent type. Actually, better to call it parent type because it could be, you could have, is it a single parent type? You see, you might want to jump different levels. What's
Right.
that?
Yes, we could have the weird situation, and I'm trying to think of an example where we specialize a type into two different, and they merge further below. Yeah. So the only requirement is that we reach one name-bearing type.
Yeah. Well, so we could say name parent types. And then it's an error if anything in the parent type hierarchy, we could have two parent types and no, because we've got to be able to parent types. So that could be different levels on the, okay, I don't know whether there's an S there. That depends on whether there could be different levels whether you just give it, see, well, this is my first attempt here. I think this is roughly right. And I think it should be possible to extract, we need some functions that extract type hierarchies and so on. So for that entity store, we need a property for the entity store, properties of the entity store, e.g.
Make a diagram like the first one.
Yeah, type graph. Entity type graph. Something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, and then we probably want entity type list and so on. It's just vertex list of that entity graph.
So, if we had an entity type object, we could ask for, well, the connected component of that type.
Yes, I think so. But I mean, I think the entity type object is a useful thing because I think it will allow us to distinguish things like property bearing types and name bearing types.
Yes.
And I don't guarantee that one day we won't want a third one of those. I mean, this is a classification of sort of types of hierarchies of things. I think we're implicitly updating old Aristotle here. It's not obvious how many times people have needed to know this stuff in the intervening years. I mean, the last serious work that I know of on stuff like this, I think, I mean, other than the common sense reasoning things, which I think I don't consider to be particularly strong in these areas, yeah, was, a few hundred years ago. Okay, anything else we need to discuss here?
No, I think kind of that's enough to make some progress and meet again in a couple of weeks.
Excellent. Okay, this was interesting. It's always good to know that. Yeah, I mean, the trick is how to not make a mistake on things like this, and I think this requires some level of sort of philosophical pragmatism or something, and not probably in the sense of pragmatism in the philosophical sense. Never mind. Okay, see you guys later. Thanks, and thanks particularly to people on the live stream. Lots of very good comments today.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.